Bill Clinton on the receiving end of some harsh words last night. Clinton was in Watts, California, campaigning at a restaurant for his wife. The criticism came from a woman in the crowd who was upset about the former president signing a controversial federal crime bill in 1994 that created lengthy sentences for many drug offenses.
Greetings, YouTube. This is the Garage Autonomist. Well, as you all know, John Lewis, one of the vanguard activists of the civil rights movement, has passed away. And as usual, the ghouls of the Democratic Party, forever under the delusion that they own the civil rights movement and the struggle against racism, when they in fact still uphold systemic racism through neoliberal economic policies, made sure to have their talons well dug into the funeral pageant of John Lewis in order to make it part of the party's election campaign. Before I get into the irony of a man like Bill Clinton, the signer of the 1994 crime bill, which had a huge impact on the working class communities of African Americans and Latinos, to speak at John Lewis's funeral regarding the black struggle, let me first speak briefly on the history of the political trajectory of the civil rights movement of the 1960s to becoming the Black Liberation Movement. Because you see, this is where and why Stokely Carmichael, who would later be called Kwame Ture, was brought up at the funeral of John Lewis. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was in a political restructuring in the face of members questioning the organization's objectives in the aftermath of the signing of the Civil Rights and the Voting Act bill. The SNCC members began to see that politically organizing independently for black power, electing their own officials to serve the black community in particular in the county of Lowndes, Montgomery, Alabama, part of what was known as the Black Belt, known for its natural wealth generating resources due to black labor both during slavery and post-slavery eras. See, earlier in the 1960s, SNCC's work focused on registering black voters in the violent racist South, and as a result of that work, the Civil Rights Act and later the Voting Rights Act, still activists at that time were beaten and arrested for working against discrimination, and so the question of organizing the grassroots to form independent black political parties was raised. By the mid-1960s, Stokely Carmichael and many others around him had formed the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, a county-wide independent political party whose emblem was a Black Panther. This should sound familiar, as it was the Lowndes County Freedom Organization would become the main inspiration for Huey Newton and Bobby Seale to form the Black Panther Party in Oakland. The formation of the LCFO inspired people to see black organizing as a way of forming a community power base, or what we call today a dual power, creating political or activism and simultaneously forming a social, political, and economic power base independent of the ruling class parties like the Democrats and the Republicans. In 1966, SNCC held its annual elections for chairman, executive secretary, and program secretary, the organization's executive layer. At that time, the chairman, John Lewis, had been in the position since the summer of 1963. A firm believer in nonviolent direct action and electoral politics, and with a firm faith in the Democrats, Lewis's politics stood as a contradiction with SNCC's rising political direction by Carmichael's milieu in the face of their efforts to build an independent party for the black community. Also, you have to understand that after 27 violent arrests of Kwame Ture as an activist, he was no longer a believer in nonviolent protest and began to take a position of black self-defense. After a late night of discussion and debates, SNCC held an initial election for chairman, which John Lewis won. But an Alabama staff member of SNCC made a passionate speech for a new vote. In the re-election held early in the morning, Carmichael won instead. Now, say what you will about the awkward way this decision-making had transpired. The process of a people's decision-making should be given the space to be held sway to passionate debate and full-on discussion versus quote-unquote what has always been or celebrity leadership, and what might look right to the white establishment who by this time saw Lewis, and not by his fault, as the quote-unquote accepted and responsible leadership by, say, the Democrats' establishment. In other words, what transpired was true black self-determination. When a group, nationality, community, or social class determines their governance and own allegiances, the very thing that the Democrats have over the years hacked away at when it comes to the black community over time. They are often hostile to it, like when Bill Clinton attacked Black Lives Matter back in 2015, when Hillary Clinton was targeted by Black Lives Matter on her campaign trail.
I don't know how you would characterize the gang leaders who got 13-year-old kids hopped up on crack and sent them out onto the street to murder other African-American children. Maybe you thought they were good citizens. She didn't. She didn't. You are defending the people who kill the lives you say matter.
Bill Clinton accused Black Lives Matter as somehow pledging allegiance to criminals by protesting police brutality. He also became increasingly hostile to those who challenged him in audiences and in the public because of the '94 crime bill. So in speaking with liberal and racist hostility aimed at SNCC's election in the 60s, mainstream media at that time had a shit fit. People like Robert Novak, columnist for the Washington Post, for example, labeled Carmichael and his supporters as reversed racists and black segregationists of all things. They called the election a coup by radicals who wanted to undermine SNCC's work in the South. Years later, Lewis was quoted saying that Stokely and I were symbols about the sense of direction of SNCC. I didn't take it personally. Change is bound to come in any movement where you don't have a top-down structure. So if this is where John Lewis left SNCC and Kwame Ture, why did Bill Clinton bring all this up at John Lewis's funeral by attacking Kwame Ture, who, by the way, has died some 22 years before? It's simple. Democratic Party is the uncola party of the ruling class and the corporate bosses versus the Republicans. See, if one party has come to be widely unpopular due to its administration at the White House at any given time, the other party must work to win the House and, of course, send signals that it can and will do better to keep the wheels of capital greased, but keep the population sated and opiated. The Democrats love to be seen by Wall Street as the party that does this the best. So there is no real love or empathy or obligation to be an ally to black people by the Democratic Party. And as the police protects property, and property, of course, generates capital for the ruling class, just like, say, the military protects the interests overseas, the Democrats want to stamp out any real challenges to structural racism. They don't mind the anger towards racism if they can control it and aim it at the competing party for political theater. But when it goes beyond their control, watch the fangs come out. And so Bill Clinton's virtue signaling to Wall Street, the suburbs, and the blue MAGAs that there's a possibility to win this election as long as we look responsible and not controlled by the radicals, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the left, and we won't be. We just all need to know that good black folks like John Lewis is the only way forward for small, superficial, incremental change, which ultimately will lead to no change at all. Bill Clinton basically tried to steal the narrative of John Lewis, Kwame Ture, SNCC, and the Black Liberation Movement to settle a score with Black Lives Matter and the protesters who are currently in the streets right now. And that is the real politics behind his grandstanding from behind John Lewis's coffin. This is the Garage Autonomist.